Hello, this is Morning, and this is Biweeklycast number 42. The hosts are here. I'm Dima Malenko.
I'm Slavorninsky.
Today we are going to be talking about the book, because this is a book club episode.
And we actually tried reading a book, but I gave up in the middle and switched to an audiobook. The book that we're going to discuss is named How Minds Change. And in my opinion, it could have been a podcast. But before we discuss it, I think we should start with the follow-up.
Yeah, I do have a little bit of follow-up. Last time we discussed distractions, and I realized that there was one thing that I forgot to mention in our distraction discussions, is how, at least I sometimes feel like I distract myself from today into tomorrow, when I leave like unfinished stuff, open browser tabs and stuff like that. And then in the morning when I come to start working on something new, past me kind of forces present me to do things that maybe I did not intend to do today, or you know what I'm trying to say, hopefully. So I thought that I would mention this, because this is one of the things I'm also working to eliminate from the distraction.
Can you give me an example of such a thing?
Right. So there might be, you do something, and sometimes I have a tendency to try to do bigger stuff in the morning, and then smaller stuff in the afternoon, and that smaller stuff includes answering questions and kind of checking out what people are doing here and there, which kind of scatters my attention across multiple dimensions. I open tabs with documents, with data, with graphs, with this and other thing. And I found that it's almost impossible ever to kind of fully complete those investigation of those diversions, so that they have to be stopped. And if I do not stop them and do not close, like capture my notes and close all the different tabs and stuff like that, tabs are particularly, like browser tabs are particularly offending for me in this regard. Then when I come back in the morning and open the laptop and I see that that there are these tabs open, and I start recalling, it would be maybe interesting or useful to do XYZ about this thing that I didn't have a chance to do yesterday. It kind of derails what I intended to do in the morning.
That makes sense, but it seems like just disorganization rather than a distraction.
Yes. Well, it's disorganization in the evening becomes a distraction in the morning. That's how I'm looking at it.
And when do you do planning? Like, is it a weekly thing or daily thing?
It's weekly and a little bit of daily. So I try to have kind of themes or several big things to complete in a week that I want to kind of put the check mark for in the end of the week. But then for each particular day, I kind of also choose what I'm going to be focusing on.
In my case, it doesn't work because my tasks, apart from the meetings or something where I have to be and I just have to be there, are usually graded to high, middle, and low priority. And my main task is not to keep any high priority tasks for the next day. So I have to finish all the high priority tasks, and everything from middle to low can be moved, but then it's lower priority than the high priority task from the next day. So they again could be shuffled and deprioritized later. So I tend to move these things over and over to the next week.
That's fair. Different approaches work, right, for different people and for different situations. I imagine things we do on a daily basis at work are quite different.
I hope so.
All right. So do you want to change your mind about how you think about your daily routines?
No, I'm fine. Stick to my biases and habits and routines.
All right. Yeah, let's stick to that then. So the book is called How Minds Change. It is a book by David McCreaney. He is also a host of a podcast and also like by coincidence or not so coincidence, author of the book by the same name. The podcast is called You Are Not So Smart. And I think this is not the first time we mentioned this podcast in that other podcast in this podcast. How would you summarize the book? Like, what is this book about, and what it is?
For me, it's hard to define as a book. I basically can name it as a playlist of episodes about different aspects of neuroscience related to changing minds. Some of them are more related, some of them are less related. I don't really see the logic between the chapters, apart from some examples that are crossing one or the other. But generally, I think it's a series of independent conversations with specific scientists about the topics related to change of mind.
I think that this is a fair characterization, and what is about to ensue is maybe a good illustration to some of the things that are discussed in the book, because when you say that, oh, you would not call this a book, but you can literally hold the book in your hands, even though you say you would not call this a book. I sort of agree with you. I think this is more of it feels like a survey of a current state of research around neuroscience and how people make decisions and how people action in response to different stimuli based on what's going through in their heads and bodies and so on. It's super vague, but to summarize that, there would be, again, survey or summary of current state of research on.
Would you give me
this
two
topic.
numbers on a scale from 1 to 7, how much you enjoyed reading the book and how much you found it useful? 7, very useful and very enjoyable. 1, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Wait, you said from 1 to 7?
Yes, 1 to 7. Why not 1 to 10? You're going to ask me, right?
Why is it that we use in different scales, in different times? I think enjoyed, I'm not sure. Now you made me think about what does it mean to enjoy reading a book.
That would be another episode. Just give me a number.
Right. So maybe 4 on enjoyment.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that evaluation varied through the time I was reading / listening to the book. It was between 4 and maybe like 4 to 5 to maybe 6 at sometimes.
In my case, enjoying is at 5 and usefulness is at 2.
Oh, interesting. Let's explore that.
Sure. So basically, why for me it's hard to name it like a book that is narrated and designed some way, because most of the chapters there are not interconnected. Like you can see that here we are talking about the church, and here we are talking about colors and how people see dresses and socks and Crocs and stuff. And they are not usually mentioned in the previous chapters, are not mentioned in the following chapters. Even the examples there, sometimes quite lightly, but you can see that it's like a build up to some conclusions. It's just like these guys found this, these guys found that, this is what we believe works, this is what we believe doesn't work. And I was really puzzled because I definitely enjoyed the second chapter about deep canvassing, and it was very promising. And I thought, like, this book is going to be amazing. And then I had to struggle through all the other chapters until it was probably one of the last ones about persuasion, where I also found some useful things. But the rest could have been a podcast that I would just listen on the walk, and I can't really find the connections between the things, and it distracts me, because when the new chapter begins, it feels like, all right, that's a new episode. Like, disregard what happened in the previous one. Let's just deep dive into this new story.
I have a proposal for us here. We have in our notes, we have a list of chapter titles where you highlighted the ones that were the most useful or interesting for you. What if we go through all of them, kind of try to recap what the chapter was about, and then think together about what was the connection of this chapter to the previous chapters and why this might be there in the book, why David might have decided, oh, I need to include this, why this is relevant. The first chapter is called Post-Truth. Was it just a general introduction to the current world where everyone supposedly has their own view of quote unquote truth and what is right and what is wrong, and everyone is sort of entitled to their own opinion about stuff, and they often confuse their opinion with being the truth?
I basically skimmed through this one because it felt as if it's like the same idea coming from page to page without actual research, because all the next ones at least have some data or some names of scientists. These ones are just like, things change. People have different experience. They experience the same situation differently, so they believe in different things. Thank you. Next chapter.
Okay, next chapter, deep canvassing. What was impressive in this chapter for you?
I really like the method. Like, I think that they discussed the idea of talking to people about their beliefs and why they believe so, and asking them questions and seeing how these questions lead or don't lead them to changing their mind about something, without actually persuading or providing any arguments. And I believe later in the other chapter I liked, it also kind of echoed that if you push a person, the person gets defensive. If you open up and if you show empathy and if you sincerely try to understand why it works the way it works, the percentage of people who potentially might change their mind works best. And I think that the method of deep canvassing that they were discussing, like people who are basically going and interviewing people on their beliefs and the reasons for their beliefs and the reasons for their beliefs, kind of reminds me how we work these days with our customers at Savvy. And to me, it was insightful, and I think I can definitely apply this thing, just rework it a bit and make it really practical.
I agree with you. This part was interesting where they started describing the practical thing with this activist organization in Los Angeles area, which does door-to-door interviewing of people. And well, what they do is interviewing of people, but by and large they're trying to shift public opinion on socially important matters like supporting certain kinds of legislation, be it the same sex marriage and vaccination and some other stuff. And I also felt like, oh yeah, great, we are getting into the kind of practicalities here. It's interesting, and I was so hoping that, hey, the next chapters would be, we talk more about deep canvassing, how it works, why it works, and how to make it useful, and then we switch to something else. And I was like, oh wait, what, why? But then I guess I gave up on like super continuity of the discussion there.
And it's not just something else. It's just like a totally different thing about the dress experiment and then the socks and the Crocs follow-up of this experiment. And I can definitely see how the author was really excited about the fact that our scientists discovered this. But this is where I started losing connections, because I still tried to understand how he's going to tie it with the previous talk. And I couldn't. And it just didn't really compute. And then when the next chapters happened, I just gave up.
Interesting. I initially I was confused as well. The next chapter with about socks and Crocs, where the author talked with the researchers who investigated the dress phenomenon, where people were seeing a photograph of a dress but calling it two different things. Was it black and gold or blue and white dress? Something along those lines. People would
gold,
remember.
Blue and something black.
So I inadvertently offered a different interpretation of the photo here without looking at the photo. Talking to those researchers, and I was confused about this initially, but then the framework that I built for myself for how the book goes was that the first chapter with general introduction. So like the topic is important in nowadays world because it causes a whole bunch of uproar in different places. And the second chapter about deep canvassing was, but there is hope. There is method, like there is indication that we might be able to navigate this complexity, this complex world. And now starting with chapter 3, maybe through chapters 7, 9, I was thinking, like these are different pieces of the puzzle, which he then tried to combine together in the later chapters.
In one of the later chapters, I don't really remember which one, but he mentioned a group of scientists who put together all research they could find in one room and tried to build up the logic. And this is what I was missing here, because now as you're describing that, this is what I actually expected the author to do, either in the very beginning or at least in between the chapters. Because basically it's like, and then I decided to talk to this guy. Like, nice. Why?
Right. And I also was only able to construct this thing mostly in retrospect, now that I was preparing to this conversation about the book.
Anyway, the main takeaway from this Socks and Crocs chapter is that things that could have double nature, meaning because of the shades they could look this way or that way, there are both colors there. They exist, and people rely on their previous experience, whether they worked in the daylight or in the night shifts, and they see things somehow differently objectively. And the interesting aspect there is reaction to alternative opinions. When you have some real life experience and then somebody says they experience different things when they see the same object, it seems very controversial, and people tend to capsulate and talk to people who see the same things they see and disregard people who see something else.
Right. Same here. So for me, the takeaway was slightly kind of different from what you described, is that this philosophical concept that we, in our consciousness, we do not see the world as it is. It's like our consciousness builds an interpretation of the signals that hit our kind of eyes, ears, whatever else, and our brain constructs the view of reality. And some of the parts of that construction we basically do not control, and we do not even know that our brain was not sure about, is this A or is it B, but it says B with low degree of confidence, but we are not aware of that fact, so that there is some element of disambiguation that happens based on our past experience, and we are not even aware consciously that this element is happening, and it might lead to different people interpreting the very same thing quite differently.
Mm-hmm. And then the next chapter 4 about disequilibrium is kind of a mess for me. So maybe I was so confused that I stopped listening attentively at this stage. But the thing I remember that whenever you present both sides simultaneously, it kind of gets people to listen more attentively. And then something else. But this is where I started losing the track. And then when chapter 5, Westboro, appeared, I felt that, all right, I will listen to it as separate chapters. How did you connect chapter 4 to the previous ones?
Wait, I think the chapter 4 was the chapter where they discussed accommodation versus assimilation, was it? Right. So the idea there was that we have our prior beliefs and kind of view of the world, and when new information comes in, we can either assimilate it, kind of squeeze it into our existing worldview, or if the change is such drastic, we might need to accommodate it by changing our worldview to fit this new information in. I think now I look at this as just a piece of kind of puzzle in the bigger picture, kind of an explanation for why sometimes presented with counterfacts, people tend to ignore them because they somehow assimilate those facts into their existing worldview and nothing changes. Mine doesn't change basically, but the very same facts in some other circumstances or different facts in the same circumstance may cause the brain to dislodge it from the current worldview and force it to accommodate the new information and then actually change. So I thought that, there was one problem, like why people argue. It can be that because their brains use different methods of disambiguation because of different past experiences. And then the second part about disambiguation is that, that there is this another thing that's happening in the process of processing new information. It can go two paths. So that
was it
connection.
The chapter where they also talked about the truthers, or it's
maybe was it the first chapter when he introduced that post-truth guy? Truth, flat Earth guy and his story, and promised to explain how he came to switch to a different camp. But I think that flat Earth story and then story of that guy was somewhat satisfactory for me, because it was like, this thing happened. Yeah, okay, cool. Nice. Why exactly? Well, we have a billion theories, each of those theories equally hard to verify and stuff.
And then the fifth chapter about Westboro is a very nice storytelling thing. Like, I think it's one of the best stories here, because it has the characters, drama, engagement, but quite little data. And I think this was one of the most storytelling podcast kind of chapters, because in the previous ones he at least tried to refer to some scientists, and this is where he just gave up and said, like, all right, this is what happened with these people. And he sometimes mentioned reaction of the world to this church in Westboro and their conflicts with the outer world, their inner conflicts. And it was curious, but I just gave up on cause and roots and let it be.
I also thought that the story was interesting. The Westboro is the church congregation somewhere in the US. I'm sorry, I don't remember where exactly, who are famous for their extreme views on how life is to be lived, and they do not refrain from expressing those views publicly by picketing burial ceremonies for soldiers and other events where people do something they vehemently disagree with. And the chapter goes to tell kind of the story about this church, and also has, what do you call it, interviews with people who used to be part of the church, but then they pulled out and became part of society at large. I think to me, once again, that would be kind of another tile that adds to a bigger picture, where we say like, this is how people interpret the inputs, and this is how what changes how they think about what they should do, sort of. And here he's trying to use this story to say that, no, the environment where the person is, which the person inhibits, also influences the actions and the decisions they make. And if you pull a person out of a particular environment, their behavior and therefore their mind can change.
And this is where I felt lack of evidence and lack of research, because in the previous articles he tried mentioning some scientific work, at least high-level scientific work. And in this case, it was just his interpretations and conclusions.
Right. I think he might have... It feels to me that he mentioned that there were some attempts at deeper research of what's going on around Westboro, but
anyway, it wasn't explicit. In the previous ones, there was always a name of a scientist. You could refer to what was happening. And in this chapter, I definitely remember the storyline. I definitely remember the drama and his conclusions out of it. But it seems the least based on anything.
I agree with you that that's mostly an anecdata point about this particularly interesting or remarkable spot in society.
Which, once again, as a separate story, makes total sense. But as part of the book, I'm trying to connect the dots here, and I don't see puzzles because basically it's like all your puzzles are from one puzzle, and then there is a puzzle from a different one because it's just a different format and different style of presentation, with more interviewing, with more quotes of people than all the previous ones, and it feels as it just doesn't fit here, which is an interesting thing. If it were just an episode of You're Not So Smart podcast, like I would definitely enjoy listening to it as a separate thing. But as I was attempting to connect it to the bigger storyline, I still felt irritation.
But do you think that this chapter could be seen as a kind of lead in or precursor, or kind of setting the stage for the next chapter, which is The Truth is Tribal, which I think tried to explore this idea of kind of social or group pressure on decision making, and therefore on the minds of individuals at a more quote unquote scientific formal level.
It potentially could, but for me it didn't link. And the fact that he basically came back to the example from the first chapter, as you mentioned, the guy who quit the conspiracy theorists movement or community, and the way they reacted. And then in this chapter they expand the idea of what people do when they leave and when they start feeling different, and when they try to communicate their truth and check and persuade, and then they get what was the
Excommunicated.
Yep. From the community. This chapter once again seemed really interesting. I kind of expected it to be way earlier in the book. I think it kind of links to an episode that I listened from You're Not So Smart about flat earthers, and many of the stories in this chapter I've already heard from the initial podcast, so I felt that I know that, like that's not new.
I think to me, I felt like there is a little bit of a connection to Vesper's story, because he said that, hey, what allowed two people whose storyline they explored in the previous chapter, this is what enabled them to pull out of the initial community. They were able to find kind of soulmates is not the right word, but they were able to find a new community to which they can switch into from their old kind of stuff, which was, I think, equally applicable to Vesper folks. And the flat earther guy definitely took a prominent stage in exploring this idea of finding a new tribe, and the overall importance of why we think it is beneficial for us as species to stick together and follow what the tribe says, because it's easier to survive that way.
Then again, it brought some confusion in terms of arguing, because some of the examples highlighted in this specific chapter are later questioned in the persuasion and street epistemology sections, because many of the things that these guys tried doing as they talked to their colleagues, both in Westboro and then in the conspiracist communities, should have worked, because they did have empathy, they did understand why people believe so, they didn't really argue, they questioned and talked to them, and it didn't work because of some reasons, probably related to the fact of the communal pressure. But when it comes to the church, it's easier to understand because they're basically offline most of the time. They see each other faces, they build deeper connections, while in terms of conspiracists, they don't meet at all. And I think it was in this chapter when he mentioned that these guys believe that they are a community just because they don't talk thoroughly and they don't fully understand what each of them really thinks about a specific issue.
I think it also can be that for different people would also call community different things. Right? It may be that for the kind of people who flat earthers are, online communities play maybe a bigger role, or big enough role in how they perceive their tribes than maybe for other people. Definitely like face-to-face connection in case of the Vesper Church, or kind of similar organizations might play different role. But we also can imagine that for people who are maybe more introverted, that power may play against them wanting to be part of the group. Like it is so complicated, right? And as armchair quarterbacks, we can, or couch experts, we can construct a whole bunch of different plausibly sounding explanations for why things things happen. I think I think that goes to show the sheer complexity of the space, right? That there are so many different factors that determine outcomes of each individual situation, that is genuinely difficult, if at all possible, to construct a universal model of how this thing might operate.
Now, once again, as you're saying this, I understand the build up to the next chapter, but I understand it from you, not from the author of the book. Chapter 7 about arguing is basically about the things that should work, because many of the research is controversial, and it can find different reasons why things work and don't work when you explore a single factor, and when you try looking for a system or a rule or a moving force that would work in sync with all of those conclusions and research, and explain why in this case it works, in this case it doesn't work. Consider multiple factors of the system. Chapter 7, in my opinion, is just a build up to the next one. And basically it has to tell the pre-story, how they came to this latest research on persuasion, how it was an issue for social scientists that research was very contradictory, and the way they landed on these beliefs and attitudes and kind of framework.
Yeah, I think that part was interesting. One is that David presented a story that said that, how do I put it, that as a species, once again, we evolved to be able to argue with one another, because as kind of early in the day, well, and this is ethereal, right? We cannot test this, so this is one of plausible explanations for what have happened, that we developed this ability to argue, basically to have different opinions, and kind of through friction of argument figure out the best possible view on the world, which helped us as a species of kind of evolve and be successful in quickly changing environments. Well, this is a nice theory. I'm not sure if we have strong evidence supporting that. It might be, because this is something that could lead to what we see now. Then and then what was the other part of this
Basically he meant, like, the entire chapter was about the fact that arguing sometimes works, and he gave examples of situations when people do change their mind, when they listen to ratio, when they are engaged in debates and they deliberate and get deeper and understand things.
Right. Yeah. Right, and I put this in the notes. I call it group smarts as an interesting idea. I think it comes from this chapter, but then once again, I think it works in some situations, right? With certain groups, you pull people together, like we call it kind of diversity in business speak, and we can, as a group, we can come up with a better idea, better solution to a problem than any one individual. But then once again, that does not always work. It's not universal that you bring together a bunch of people and they are going to come up with the best possible idea, or at least in my experience, that was that. But then I would agree that this is probably a lead up to the next stage, where he said, which is like saying, well, we are built to argue. And the next chapter, persuasion, this is how we leverage this mechanism or capability that we have in our brains for the betterment of humanity. And how do we do that? How do we persuade people?
The way I remember it, once again, as I was listening, I could have missed some of the aspects, but I definitely highlighted the idea of empathy and the role of being nonviolent in terms of persuasion, because the more intense arguing is, the least likely people are to change their mind. The way of considering different sides of an issue and presenting all evidence and all arguments you can see on the table, not just your side, but both sides, and showing the willingness to deep dive and analyze and talk about it, and creating some real life experience or referring to real life experiences that will later be mentioned in the next, I believe, chapter about street epistemology, and was mentioned previously in deep canvassing chapters. These are the key tools that I remember. And then they were also highlighting some sub things like social authorities. And but then again, he mentioned the tools and they said, well, but then it doesn't work if community is against this authority or if something doesn't go right. So the other things seemed less universal than these that I mentioned first.
Same here. And I think for me, the takeaway, not the takeaway, but the thoughts that I had after this chapter, and I think it connects to what you mentioned previously, that some of the methods or things that are described in the book are essentially what you use when you communicate with your clients and kind of how you collaborate with them, trying to figure out a solution for a particular problem. And this is also where I felt that, some of the things I'm doing, or some of the things I came to doing in my daily work, also have connections to this idea. And one of the things that a lot of a big part of my work is kind of system design, and not only designing systems myself, but also providing feedback on the designs by others. And I found that the better way for me to provide constructive feedback, especially in situations where I disagree with how design should be, is to ask questions about how they came up with the design they came up with, because and figure out, oftentimes engineers are not very diligent with articulating the requirements they're building for. And I questioning or line of inquiry when working with those designs would be to figure out, let's get to a explicit list of requirements that we are trying to build for, and then connect the design to those requirements, and then maybe see if there are some controversial pieces in the design, trace them back to requirements and see how much of a requirement that actually is, or maybe there are some other requirements that are missed, which would influence this whole thing, which I felt is not too dissimilar to what this chapter is talking about and what you were talking about empathy and figuring out, clarifying the process of coming to conclusions, and what are the priors that we are starting with, what is the logic that participants use to arrive at conclusions, and so on and so forth.
And this is what I usually see at debating, because these skills and tools are usually used in professional debating, but it's fun to see how people tend to manipulate with this sort of activities. They use fake empathy questions to provoke rather than to understand and to move on. And the most experienced debaters, the winners of global championship, they are truly curious about the reasoning. They sometimes assist and help people shape their beliefs, and they are looking for connections and the depth in the idea to see how it was built up in order to deal with it on the next level. And many techniques that I dislike in modern business communication, they just take the attributes of these things. Like, you have to ask questions, like ask 6 whys. Like, really, like, do I have to do that? Or I have to ask 5 just because I have to ask 5, or 6 because I have to ask 6, or I should find the true reason. That's the point why I'm asking. And as I was reading this article, I could see that the findings of this research has been misused and many people who teach communication these days, they tend to take a specific aspect, like copy their body language. Sweet. And when you do that, like you waste a lot of your mental energy thinking how you sit and how you breathe and how you smile, and you stop listening, and then the conversation falls apart. Nice. Like you tried doing one thing and then you failed 3 other important aspects of the persuasion.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think when you are part of such conversation, you can feel, right, when the other side or the other person kind of truly means it, or when we have a script or checkbox to tick here, let's tick them. And this is also like in circling back to my previous example, and I also find it that when I go into conversation on let's say on design with the idea to persuade that other party, I'm often less successful and at doing that than when I'm going there with the goal to better understand the problem that we are trying to solve and find the best solution for that problem, irrespective of whether that solution is the solution I propose or someone else. And if I go in the conversation with this open mind, it feels to me, at least anecdotally, that I get better results in changing people's minds, when changing the mind is not the primary objective. The primary objective was what's the best thing we can do.
Mm-hmm. So once again, that seemed to me the most important chapter of the book, because then when it moves to street epistemology, I had a flashback to deep canvassing, and like, I've heard this. This is totally not new. And the method that they describe and the insights they describe, like, yep, like you told me 6 chapters ago, like I remember.
Right. It was another story where I guess someone, I think the name of the hero there was Anthony or something, maybe something or other, who basically on his own or with his community arrived at same conclusions or same methods of talking to people with hopes of changing their mind. I think it can be taken as an additional data point that shows that there is indeed something in this particular method when different people independently come up or converge roughly on the same approach.
That should have been a single chapter where they bring in these 2 stories. They say, like, this is what scientists did, this is what this guy did, this is how it works, and this is where it doesn't work. Like, why would you split it with 6 chapters of some other stuff?
Once again, I agree with you, and I see this as a more or less general problem with popular science books and materials of that nature, where they put some sort of storytelling ahead of everything else. So they try to tell us, with different degrees of success, let's put it this way, to tell a story through the entire book, to keep readers entertained and engaged, because this is a popular science book. It's not for scientists and stuff. But then when presenting science, it lacks significant degree of rigor, and to me the exhaustiveness of the storytelling is definitely lacking. It's like you give one particular example, but then what are the conclusions that we can draw from one particular example? Like, can we, when nothing is said about how representative this example is to the entire domain we are looking at and things of that nature? Or is it a particular example which is neat and tidy and interesting with very, very specific set of circumstances, and in general, whatever we see in that example does not apply, it cannot be generalized? All of those stuff, all of those aspects are often missing from this kind of book, and I agree, it is frustrating.
And then we have the last 10th chapter, which seems to me as an attempt to zoom out and put it all together, which didn't work for me. Like, I couldn't see the connections and the links they were trying to build. But basically, there was an attempt of getting from the individual level to a social level and see how it works on the bigger groups than just single people and communities.
And I think there is a case to be made that this last chapter maybe undermines some of the conclusions of previous chapters as well, because the examples of deep canvassing were coalesced around the issue of same-sex marriage in the US. And then this last chapter tells that, like the environment at large changed, that there were changes in the world which enabled this shift to happen. And then you cannot help but question, all right, with all those changes at play, with the world and society and socium moving in a particular direction at all, how much of an effect does deep canvassing have? If anyway things were moving in that direction, does it mean that just deep canvassing or that
Doesn't
attempt
really
to
change, but just illustrates things that change
yes, it
by
was
themselves.
Was it just happy or not happy coincidence that you happen to ask the right questions at just about the right time to illustrate something? And I think that there is a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B there, but once again, kind of holistic view and holistic, rigorous presentation of the domain we are researching would be super, super helpful. But I guess that was not the objective of the book. Maybe, sort of. We don't know.
So, summing it up, would you recommend this book to anyone? And if so, who and what for?
I think I would recommend this book. What for reading? I think it's not particularly. The book is not heavy enough to be to be used as a weight to hold things in place. So reading is probably the best thing you could do with the book.
Not like decorations or
not
fighting.
Well, rather neat with the dog and stuff. Maybe it can be used as a decoration, but I think it's for 2022/2024. It's a rather decent survey of the current state of research on this topic. Maybe if you look at the book more as you said, as a collection of data points or stories rather than an exhaustive and complete look at the subject, it can be useful. It can lead you to prompt and look deeper into some of the aspects that you would consider more interesting or impactful for the things that you're doing.
I totally agree with you, and I think I would recommend it to my colleagues who do soft skills training, so they could either take some stories from there or check their tools and the things that they teach, whether they conflict or don't conflict to these latest things. But I think it could be also a nice starter for a research. Like there are last names and research mentioned there could be interesting, but I wouldn't say that my junior colleagues should definitely read it and it will change the way they communicate, or it will somehow impact the way we build business development process or our meetings or something else. So just for people who work in communications and who have been interested in neuroscience and these kind of topics previously, that I find it useful. If you're just a beginner or you've never been into neuroscience research before, that's not the best way to start.
Were there any other bigger maybe takeaways or thoughts that you had about the book as a whole? Some ideas presented there.
I think that given the description and the aura of the writer, I misjudged the book and I built wrong expectations about it. When you suggested this book, I said, we should probably read it in paper because it's probably going to be really heavy. And I just tried connecting some previous experiences, which was totally wrong. The audiobook, I think, is the proper format for it and way better than, at least my experience in the later chapters when I switched to the sound was much more pleasant than when I tried to read it through. And I think that one of the meta conclusions I can come up with is that things that you believe in terms of tools and frameworks and methods and communication, like feedback model or types of questions in coaching or debate and argument structure, some things that you take as given might have been proved wrong and you don't know it. So the meta thing is to keep your toolbox updated. And when some things seem to not work as effectively or change the efficiency, make a deep dive and see what's beneath it, like what has been the latest research on this topic.
Yep, totally agree with this. For me, maybe two or three things would be one that through the book I saw some interesting kind of general connections to the like chaos theory or theory of complexity, because this like the social things is like the social fabric is an example of a complex system where additional kind of behavior or additional things can emerge, which are not present at the individual level, like the tribal truth kind of thing. And also the brain itself is a super complex thing, which also has and subject to effects that are studied by complexity theory. So I kind of appreciated, or like I smiled internally a little bit when I said, "Oh yes, that's because XYZ that I know from my other studies." I think one other thing for this specific book that I felt was underappreciated by the author, and maybe it was a result of the examples that he chose to illustrate many of the ideas, where the examples were like the flat earth and some of the other social issues that were, by and large, one can say that there is, of the two sides of the argument, there is a better side, right? Most people would say that no, the earth is not flat. The earth is it's not a sphere, it's a geoid, but that's a different topic. And we have multiple examples of how we leverage the knowledge of earth not being flat in practical real life and so on. So there is definitely a preference for one side of debate versus the other side of debate. And a lot of the things and methods are portrayed, how we convert people from thinking wrongly to thinking rightly about the stuff. But in the broad scheme of things, that's not always true. Not on every matter we have a clear cut, this is better, this is quote unquote closer to truth versus the other side of the
Are you building
debate.
up to post-truth, yeah?
No, I'm building up to the idea that the methods that were proposed and shown as effective, like trying to go deeper into reasoning and so on and so forth, and how people come to conclusions. When that conversation happens, the questioner also gets influenced by the answer, and we cannot discard the fact that in some situations it is possible that instead of changing some other person's mind, you are going to change yours. And this, I don't think this was ever reflected in this book, maybe except for one of the examples where David was talking with the guy in the retreat, where he then decided not to continue the line of deep canvassing conversation because of what he heard. But when they discussed the guy's belief, like 50% of 50-point belief in God, and he told about his experience in Jerusalem and stuff.
Yeah,
stuff
but that's
like that.
exactly the first example from the book, as these flat earthers or truthers were interviewing victims and their relatives and firefighters, and this is what they were doing, and this is when the guy changed his mind in the process of interviewing the others.
Well, that's where I maybe did not. This particular example, maybe I didn't see it that way, because given that they were filming a show, right, for this, when they said interviewing in that context, I said like, oh, that's like interviewing for the show, the flat earthers interviewing those guys. But yeah, that's fair point. But that's, I guess, at any rate, this was not illustrated as a kind of side effect or an effect of those conversations. That the fact that this is two-way street, it always was portrayed that there is a side that is wrong, quote unquote, and the side that is right, and then this is the method for the right side to kind of convince or have the wrong side correct their opinions. And I think I do believe that this is always a two-way street, and we need to be prepared that when you question and get to know the arguments of the other side more, you are as likely to change your mind as you are changing minds of the other party.
Yeah, that is fair. So I guess we could round it up, and the next book club is going to be about a fiction book, right?
Is it? Well, we can make it a fiction book. Do you have anything in mind?
I believe we wanted to try this starter villain with the cat on the cover.
With a cat on the cover. Okay. So the next episode is going to be
It's not the next episode. It's the next book club episode.
Next book club episode is going to be a book with the cat on the cover, and it's going to be a fiction book. I cannot imagine a science or something other book with a cat on the cover.
What about a dog on the cover of How Minds Change?
Well, and as I said, that like if you have like quantum physics and stuff with Schrodinger's cat, you can totally have a cat on the cover of a scientific book as well. So I take that back. So my mind is changed on this one, but at any rate, we are going to read and discuss this book, whatever it is, and then the next episode is going to be in roughly 2 weeks, and stay tuned.
Hopefully good ones. Yeah.
Good ones.